Welcome back to Notice That, an EMDR podcast. We are here in the studio today getting ready to talk about EMDR and substance abuse, which is a huge area to talk about.
You could probably tackle it in 45 minutes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, 30.
That should scratch the surface. Almost, I was thinking this is like our origins, our therapy origins.
It
our
is
EMDR
our therapy.
origins.
Yes, it is. These were yours too, our first clients where we cut our EMDR teeth, which is a hell of a way to begin. But it is for a lot of therapists, the place where we begin because it's such a huge need. And it certainly taught me a lot. And I hope that some of those early clients of mine are okay. I would like to make a public apology.
Yeah.
Just kidding. There were some mistakes made and I really did learn a lot. But I think today, rather than trying to do a perfectly thorough job of going through all of the different protocols that are out there for substance abuse, we're going to keep it a little bit more high level and talk conceptually together about ways of working with substance abuse and EMDR. And then definitely giving specific mention to protocols that we find useful and that have a lot of research behind them that we would recommend to you guys.
Yeah, I think even like just ways of conceptualizing substance abuse. Like this was the population that motivated me to get trained in EMDR because it was like, okay, working at a treatment center, these are all the things we're doing.
Yeah.
And it's like totally not working. like
Yeah,
we're
like
not even
a little
touching
bit.
it. No. And when I sit down to run a consequence worksheet with my client and they're looking at me like, you have no idea. Like why are we even doing this? Just realizing
Because my boss told me we have to. That's why.
Yeah.
There's so much underlying this presentation that is not a matter of choice or control, or are you trying hard enough, or are you
Don't you understand
are you motivated enough?
Exactly. Yeah. My experience, because I haven't worked directly in a substance abuse like clinic or treatment setting, mine has just been with those that have presented with it in therapy, just in my private practice. But I have done a lot just with like conceptualizing the neurobiology of addictions. And so I'm excited for this conversation just to get to hear from you both on your experience from where you started and also what the change in your conceptualization of substance abuse has been since then. So I'm very excited.
I think the other kind of greatest desire for me of this time is along the same theme that we approach every episode with, is like the de-shaming of the presentation. And this is a presentation that seems to get so much shame culturally from our community.
There's a black sheep.
Yes. Yeah. And from like family members and loved ones that don't know what else to do. And their last attempt to try to help is shame. And so just really wanting to approach this topic from a de-shaming stance and de-shaming of the human behind it, de-shaming of how everyone's experiencing it, all of that.
Yeah.
Well, and I do think that kind of the whole way through, it feels important to acknowledge that there are some addictions that are much more socially and culturally sanctioned than others. And so when we're talking about this, we will use a lot of examples that are from the addictions and, compulsive patterns that people deal with that tend to get a lot of cultural backlash. But that's because people that have the more socially acceptable addictions don't have to come to therapy as often because they're not getting as much pushback from family, from friends, from life, etc.
They don't cost as much.
That's right. But that doesn't mean that they're not, number one, treatable. And number two, we do see those in therapy. And so kind of opening our awareness to remembering that there are a lot of behavioral patterns that have this addictive quality to them.
Yes.
That as we talk about where we believe substance abuse and other addictions come from, that it's going to apply to those behaviors as well. Things like, America's favorite, workaholism, socially sanctioned, can have real problems, and we can treat that. And it comes from the same origin story as an alcoholic, which is fascinating.
Sugar.
Hey,
I'll
Jen,
just drop that
lay
one
off.
in there. Oh no, I'm not talking about you.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
We can probably all resonate with that work and sugar.
Work and sugar. Well, hey, cheers, guys.
Coffee.
Coffee. Yeah, here we are with a little caffeine.
Yeah.
And so
But
that's
it's
a
sugar-free
socially-
creamer. Does that count?
Mine is not. Mine is sugared creamer.
Your
So
words to me, Jen, in receiving the cup were tastes like dessert. So
Okay, Bridger.
So
what?
my point is that we have the privilege of laughing about our addictions because they're socially sanctioned ones.
Exactly.
And there are plenty that have like real life-threatening and tremendous costs to them. And so we don't want to make light of that, but we do want to highlight that there is a list of addictions and compulsive behaviors that get a lot more shame than others. And we want to be conscious of that in therapy so that we don't perpetuate those cultural patterns. And that we don't overlook the struggles that people have just because those would be socially positive ones. So things like exercise addiction. We would compliment somebody for losing 10 pounds and getting fit and miss something essential. And so I think that's a good frame as we move into this conversation.
Yeah, I think for me as well, coming to the world of therapy was somewhat of a culture shock experience when it came to substance abuse. Because for me, growing up, like where I grew up, like, I mean, you could call it substance abuse, but that was not a part of the culture at all. Like, and I remember
It was just a Saturday.
or a Tuesday or like, because
Or Monday morning.
I remember in even my undergrad, learning about the DSM's designation of like alcohol abuse and looking at the, like the number of drinks per day, per week.
Yeah.
And just like, well, this is my entire family.
Yes.
And they are all extremely functional people. And so the level of impairment with this number of drinks per day, that doesn't track.
Line. Yeah.
Yes.
And so even then it was like this, like, oh, like, yeah, that's in my blood. Like that's my whole family for generations and generations. And not just with alcohol, like with all kinds of things. And so to me, it wasn't until I found the strategy reconceptualization of substance abuse that it really started to matter to me.
Yeah.
Because at first I thought it was just people that wanted to shame other people. And so they found a metric by which to justify that. And institutions have a tendency to do that. And so I was just like, whatever, like if you're going to call my family addicts, I think that's a choice that you have. But for me, when I started talking about it in the way of strategy, that's when it really clicked.
Yeah.
That's when I really started to see like, oh,
This might
Even
matter.
on the flip side of that, of the people, as you're saying, like wanting to shame other people,
yeah,
the strategy in that of a
100%.
fear, an attempt to control, an attempt to protect from. And so the word strategy, I think, I mean, at this point, you listeners are probably very familiar with us using that. We're using it so frequently, but looking at the kind of the attraction to or the utilization of these substances is strategy.
Yeah.
The response pattern to them, how we respond to them, how we feel about them is strategy. And all of that comes from like, how did we experience that? What are our, understandings and experiences of that?
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the helpful things about reframing substance abuse that way is that we can begin to look at how substance abuse is a strategy that can meet multiple different needs. And it's not always the usual story. Not every alcoholic drinks to numb their feelings. Some, what we would perceive as alcoholics from a DSM perspective, that is their strategy of social engagement and connection. Like this is how we do relationships. And numbing doesn't really factor into it. In fact, it's a way of feeling more and allowing more feeling to flow between people. And so I think that's the other shift is being able to look at this isn't always what we were told it was going to be about.
Yeah.
The story is as complex as a human being. And so when we move into therapeutic relationship with someone around substance abuse, like being really curious about, okay, we know it's a strategy, but a strategy for what?
Yeah.
What is the need that is getting met? And what is the emotional learning that taught you to get your needs met in this way?
Or that it wasn't acceptable to get them met
in another way
without it in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in that, looking at strategy, regardless of what it is, we're kind of lumping substance use or, you know, compulsions of any sort, like in that category. If it's strategy, we only need strategy when, like when we are interpreting or perceiving a lack of safety or an attempt to receive connection with another person, like that is when our systems employ strategy. It's not from a conscious place that we're thinking like, oh, this will be a really good route and I can manipulate the situation into this. It's very just like deeply ingrained a response.
And even when it is a salve for not feeling safe, it's likely not even a conscious choice in that regard of like, I don't feel safe, so I'm going to do this, whatever it is. It's just this gives my body the physiological either lack of feeling or additional feeling that it needs to hold itself together in this moment.
Yes. It's not the equal like 1-to-1. Oh, if I drink a beer now, I'm protected in some way.
Not at all.
Right. But and I think especially when we get into substance abuse, we're talking about chemicals
Yes.
in the system. Like we are ingesting chemicals that are going to, you know, change the experience, the activation or the feeling. And so in that, if it's a felt sense of lack of safety or disconnection, it may not be, this is how I'm going to get safe or find the connection. In fact, it might be the opposite, the avoidance of, but it's a way to be able to tolerate the experience, the internal experience in those environments.
Well, and I think the concept of what fires together, wires together is also a huge piece of this, because sometimes when we, you know, get in there and we're poking around in somebody's nervous system and uncovering the way all of this got built, it was simply the mere presence of that activity or that substance when the other thing was happening. And because they always or often happened simultaneously, they got wired together and the body figured out like, oh, well, if I push that button, then this other thing also happens. And so that wiring gets ingrained. And then the more they repeat that, the more ingrained it gets. And, you know, we can get really, really far down the road where that entanglement is powerful, but the original moment of learning is long forgotten, not by the body, but long forgotten to consciousness.
Yeah. One case example that already just is like coming to my mind so strongly in this as we're talking, it shows the complexity, I think, of why an addiction, quote unquote, a single addiction, is always contextualized to the system larger than just that one issue. And this case was a number of years ago, but it was that alcohol helped numb the shame that kept this person from living the life that they wanted to in their expression of their sexual identity. And so the only pairing they had with expressing their authentic identity was with alcohol. And then that wasn't enough, so we paired it with risk-taking, and then it was into this place of now an eating disorder, and all of this was there to suppress the expression of this identity. And that to me shows the strategy and the deliberate floundering that's happening in the system in trying to cover and trying to keep from expressing that. Really, like, just talking about it as a disordered label doesn't make any sense.
No.
It must be contextualized.
Well, I feel like that's such a good example of so much of the time, you know, we conceptualize it as, well, they're addicted to that substance.
Right.
They're addicted to that thing. When in actuality, no, the addiction is to the suppression or expression of something that they desire or do not desire.
That's exactly it.
And the brilliance of our bodies means that, well, if alcohol quits working, then I'll move to something else. And when that quits working, then I'll move to something else.
Yeah.
And so it's not about the thing or the substance. Now, there is a chemical process that can start to occur. That
And
means the body
condition that over and over again. Yeah.
But the actual addiction, separate from chemical dependency, because we functionally see them, they function very, very differently in the body. You cannot become chemically dependent on gambling, and yet we see all the manifestations, and that's why there's now, you know, inclusion of process addiction in the DSM, because clearly there is another mechanism happening there, and that's what you're describing, Bridger, is this compounding of, it was never about the thing itself.
Yeah.
It was about how I was using something, literally anything that I could find that would stop me from feeling this thing that I'm terrified of.
Yeah. And that, to me, I think that understanding is so helpful for even the treatment, because if you chase the thing, it's not going to do anything.
No, that's whack-a-mole.
Exactly. We're going to find another thing. And for them, it was like, I came from a, you know, very evangelical home, and therefore who I truly feel I am is not allowed. And so I have to shame myself into being this perfect object all the time. And then alcohol is the only way that I found actual freedom. And that led to all these other kind of things that added to the experience of actually getting able to be myself. But it was in a way that was actually more toxic than it was healing. And so it just led to more and more, let's add this process. Let's add this process. Let's add this process.
Of, like, who they find themselves to be, like, with the support of alcohol, then becomes the source of the shame, or like the target of the shame. Now people are shaming for what their behaviors are while they're drinking, or that they are drinking, or how often, which, if we're looking at that, is just further perpetuating the core issue of I'm not okay as I am. And then that just continues to generalize into the need of either more drinking, more frequent drinking, or other behaviors, or, you know, we've now have, you said, eating disorder, or other pieces like layering on top of that, if we're just trying to manage the behavior, and oftentimes managing it through shame approaches. We're going to further perpetuate the problem. Melissa, when you were talking earlier about it's not necessarily the substance they're addicted to, or, you know, that specific behavior, that's so true. I think so often, like with my clients in the past, looking at, they would say these things like, I hate the drug. Like, I despise it. There wouldn't be, there's not a desire or this choice of like, well, I choose that, I like it more than that. It's like, I actually, like, I hate that, but I cannot, almost the ritual around it, the process of it. I mean, we've got extreme stories of clients that would, I won't tell some of how horrific they were, but not even utilize the substance anymore, but they'd still go through the same ritual around it, and it would meet that same need in some way. And then the other layers too of hearing people say, like, it's not really like, I don't hate who I am with that. I hate who I am without it. Like, I can't tolerate to be with me, like, as I am. And so then this, like, layering of what does that substance or that behavior, what kind of protection does that bring around? So there's so many pieces of it that if we're not addressing the core issue, if we're just coming from the top down and managing behavior or seeing it for what the behavior is telling us, we're going to miss the issue all the way through.
Well, and I think, you know, well, I guess I like to think that nowadays that is a pretty well understood concept for therapists of, you know, you can't just manage the behavior and expect to be treating an addiction. It just doesn't work. I hope that's common knowledge therapeutically at this point. But what isn't is that when people are coming in, or when families are sending family members for treatment, that understanding of the long road to healing, because it is so much more about that deeper work than it is about the behavioral management or just ending or stopping or suppressing the behavior, that is hardly what it's about at all. And so sometimes the tension that's experienced is not as the therapist saying, well, I just want to manage the behavior. It's actually the client wanting that, or their family wanting that, because they don't know how to conceptualize addiction, because we have these huge cultural stories around addiction that still perpetuate that idea that this is a behavioral problem, and therefore could have a behavioral solution, which it doesn't.
Yeah, and I think there's so much hope in that it would have a behavioral solution. That if we just change this, it's going to fix the whole thing. But that to me is a severe kind of under-reading of what the human organism really is. You know, what does it mean to be a complex system? It means to take one stimuli and to then diversify the dependence of that and how it's utilized into multiple other presentations that you have, which together make up the person that you're committed to being in this moment, in this atmosphere, or in this climate. And I think that's where, yes, I think the addictions can be really concerning and they can be life-threatening. But if we have a conceptualization that we just need to take that away from them, that to me is a very problematic conceptualization. I mean, yes, I think it's a tight rope in so many ways from a treatment perspective, because there are things that we absolutely should be more rigid on with what we're wanting them to stop doing.
Right.
But
I think the motivation and the framing of those more rigid moments in our therapeutic work, it's still not from that top-down suppress the behavior because that's the problem perspective. It actually, and I'm curious to hear how you guys would phrase this, but it has to do with what is the bare essentials that we need to do to get them safe enough so that they can do the work that is going to set them free.
Well, and I think, yeah, absolutely. And to me, where that isn't necessarily irresponsible is there are situations where it has to be absolutely limited.
It's dangerous.
It's dangerous, whether it's to the individual, to the kids around them,
to the community at large.
Yes. But in that, what we can say is if that strategy is going to be cut off, whether they go into residential treatment and they literally don't get access to that substance anymore while they're in there. If it's going to be cut off, we have to be okay with knowing that other strategies have to come in place to fill in the gap. Like that is going to be there, but we are going to be working with and addressing the core issue in that. And the other strategies can be acceptable. Right. And that can be what the system is needing to, how do I even survive if I don't have that one thing I've been going to? And I'm going to need these other strategies.
Yeah. I started my practicum experience at a mission.
I forgot that.
Yeah, working with...
Is that where your office was in a real closet, like an actual broom cupboard?
Yeah, well, a utility closet.
There we go. Yeah,
there was half full mop buckets, toilet paper rolls, and
I just love that picture of you sitting in a mop cupboard with a client.
You actually have a picture, or just the visual?
No, I need to see this.
I'm glad we're laughing, and I want us to come back to this laughing because what I'm about to tell you is pretty tough.
Okay.
Yeah.
A moment of levity before.
Yes, but it's just so. I mean, one of the most difficult experiences in that environment, besides the instability of service delivery, like it was hit or miss if they were going to show up.
Yeah.
But the work that we were doing was even just trying to increase their overall ability to participate meaningfully in the program that they were in the treatment program. And one of the individuals was trading, was in the process of trading one addiction to cutting for meth. Like that was, it was like, which one do you want me to do? Because I'm doing one of them. And that relationship ended without me knowing like which direction they would go, because I came back the next week, which is typical for that space.
Yeah.
Worked for 2 months with him and then he was gone after getting to that place. But that to me just shows this, like, it's about needing to understand what the system is really doing in there. Endorphin for endorphin. What do you want to do?
Yeah. I must have something.
I can't do this. And he said the voices start if I don't do one of these.
Yep.
What am I supposed to do? And like, that's just like the, man, can I just, let's get you into it. Like, just like all these like desires to just like, let's get you out of the situation that you're in. Let's get you into this like really loving and nurturing place and just be able to like completely
Can we
detox.
Wave a magic wand and take you to utopia so that you can heal? Yeah.
Because I can't imagine that balancing.
And that, like, that story feels normal in the world of substance abuse treatment. Yeah. Like that is every day. And like, there's a part of me that wants to acknowledge for therapists that are still, in that world and doing that day in and day out, like, holy crap.
That's wild.
Yeah. I mean, I did it for 4.5 years and was 32 years old with high blood pressure, and my doctor telling me you have to stop. And that's why. Yeah. Because that's the reality, this profound feeling of helplessness and impossibility, just the paradox of the situations that we find ourselves in with clients. It, is heart-wrenching to say the least.
Telling my supervisor that story of like what was going on with this case, and they said they just reflected the feeling, but they were like, I mean,
that's the world.
So what else you got going on?
Yeah,
like it was just like
that's it.
Yeah. What other cases do you want to talk about today?
And the toughest piece of all of it that just is so much grief coming up at me is the reality.
I know.
For some of them, many people.
Yeah.
I mean, the number of times I experience I have to be high on meth to take care of my kids.
Yes.
So do you want me to
not?
Otherwise I'm debilitated with depression in my bed. Can't get out. They won't get food. They won't have anything. But
So
if
do you
I
not
get high,
want me to feed my kids?
right, I'll go get a job. I'll have some money there for them. I'll do all these things. The alternative. It's dark. It's a really dark place to sink into and really consider. It's not hopeless, but it's dark.
Not hopeless, but it's dark.
Yeah. Oh man, this feels so heavy. Well, I guess in summary of that one point.
Yeah, sorry, that wasn't on the bullet point.
No, that's on our agenda. In summary of that one point, whether or not we're considering harm reduction or crisis management or this behavior management that's good enough for safety, we have to keep our eye on the felt sense of safety throughout. That is what the individual is needing. And that doesn't just mean, yes, it means actual physical safety. Are you being threatened in your home right now? It's going to be really hard to treat your substance abuse if you are.
Yep.
But also their felt sense of safety in the world. Am I safe to be who I am? Am I safe to be in relationship with another person? Those experiences that we can do some of that, step-by-step work that is encouraged in treatment centers. But if we've got our eye on that objective while we do it, it's a very different experience. Yeah. I will say often it's about doing top-down work with a bottom-up perspective, a bottom-up therapist.
Yeah.
And so we can, those of you that are listening that work in treatment centers or work with substance abuse, and you're saying, I have to do these things, or we do need to manage the behavior, things in their world are falling apart if we don't. Be able to approach it from a top-down way of managing behavior and shifting cognition, but show up as bottom-up with them, experience that with them, be connecting back to that felt sense of safety and seeing them as a human behind all their strategies and showing a sense of positive regard and acceptance for that human and all of that.
Yeah, and I think, I just have so many humans at this point that I'm thinking about over the years. It's impossible to not sit here and be Rolodexing through previous clients and everything that they taught me. But I think the number one thing that is kind of standing out as you're talking, Jen, is when we do it that way, even in those awful conversations that we're having that feel more top down, where we're talking about how are we going to keep you from drinking this week? Because if you do it again, you're going to jail. How many different conversations did I have that went exactly along those lines? I think having that bottom up perspective and having done the groundwork with the client to really lay that foundation of, this is a strategy that I have tremendous heartfelt understanding for how you find yourself in this predicament. This makes sense to me. When we have that established in the relationship, when we have to move into those harm reduction and management conversations, it's not shaming. It has much more of this feeling of can I come alongside you and fight this demon with you? How can we approach this and have you feel like you have somebody that is working with you and conceptualizing this with you to find something that's going to help. And even if we have to, say things that feel like tough love, one of the phrases that gets used a lot to explain this way of working, which I have kind of a love-hate relationship with that phrase because I think it gets misused. But if we're having those kinds of conversations from this grounded place of, I truly don't feel any shame towards you or feel like you should be ashamed of this because I understand the how and the why and empathize with it greatly. Our clients can feel that. They can sense the difference, and it makes a huge amount of difference in the way that those conversations are received. And in my experience, actually helps with the harm reduction. And because we don't trigger the other strategies of things like isolation and rebellion and the furthering into shame and the spiraling that can occur in that place. But yeah, it's a very challenging kind of tightrope to walk of how do I push you, but then also hold you lovingly in this space. Yeah.
A little soapbox of mine. I'm just, as you're saying
go right
all
ahead.
that, I love...
Get on that tough love soapbox, Jen.
Well, that's not what I love so much hearing you say, like, I see why you do it. It makes sense to me.
Yes.
Because everyone else in their world says this makes no sense.
Oh, yeah.
Don't you see? Don't you understand?
Don't you see how irrational this
Yes.
is? Yeah.
Talk about a consequence worksheet. It's basically like laying out this list that says, oh, wait, I think you were too dumb to get it the first time.
Right.
So when I write it down on a paper now,
Right. If we put it
you'll
in
get
black
it.
and white, it's going to click for you that this is just a stupid choice you're making.
And once you see that, you'll be able to
Cost-benefit
do.
analysis around
Yeah.
Once you
I
see
forgot
that,
those.
you'll be able to make a different choice.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so if you can just see it, then, and if I can just help you and give you that favor of like showing it to you on paper, then you'll stop doing it. And there is something to like bringing, I mean, we say it all the time, like with awareness comes choice, like there's aspects of that, like we can bring pieces of the consequences into awareness,
Insight. Yeah.
insight into that. So I'm on a soapbox. I'm not really shaming anyone who does consequence worksheet.
No, it's mostly that
But-
those tend to get imposed on us as a
Yes.
thing that we have to do, or new
Or the
therapists
client
are told
has to
this
do
is,
before they can move on to anything
Also,
else.
take this paper into court and wave it in front of a judge. Yeah, that's
Yes.
therapeutic.
But for someone to look at you and say, it makes complete sense, maybe not cognitively and rationally. Rationally, maybe it doesn't make a ton of sense as to like, you are spending this amount of money and, you know, like whatever those things are. But from like my body feels like it makes sense. I wouldn't want to feel that either. Or I wouldn't know how to do, if I had, you know, that experience, I wouldn't know how to connect with people either.
Right.
Like being able to like find where does it make sense, because it would not be present if it didn't.
Right.
It just wouldn't be there.
Fundamentally.
Well,
Yeah.
yes.
And I feel like any human being alive can find some spot in their life where they make profoundly irrational decisions that are emotionally incredibly rational. Like that is not, we don't have to hunt very hard most of the time to find those. And I mean, an easy one is like, nobody makes their bed in the morning. Well, maybe you do.
No.
Okay.
Hey, okay. That's a whole conversation. What does that mean?
There are some humans in the world that make their beds.
It's not me.
No, okay, good.
You should see my bedroom.
But like all of us know that supposedly you feel better and you sleep better
Supposedly.
if you make your bed, right? Like this is like a common knowledge thing, but none of us
sleep
do
great.
it. I sleep great. So I'm just saying that like even small embodied experiences of I know better supposedly, but still behave other than what my knowledge gives me. Like if you feel into that for a minute, emotional logic is still very logical. There is a very clear train of rationality that brings us to that conclusion over and over. And so being able to track that in our own selves, it's not very difficult to track the emotional rationality, the mammalian rationality behind severe addiction. And doing that with a client is way more impactful than explaining to them why this is not cognitively logical and rational.
Yeah. So in all of our work with substance abuse, I want to draw the connection now of like EMDR. Like we've got the conceptual understanding of it. It needs to be the spiral approach. This is a way that we reference, you know, working not in just this linear way with in our trainings, we talk about this, but the spiral approach, we are always balancing symptom reduction, managing the addiction, while also going in deeper and saying, what's the core issue?
Yeah.
It's a back and forth. We don't just check the box of the symptoms been reduced, we've managed the behavior, and now we do the work underneath. And we don't just only do the work without considering the way that the symptom is presenting. So it's just constantly, we're circling back over and over and kind of checking in and tending to both throughout the entire treatment process.
Yeah. And for me, the sort of origin of substance abuse is a systemic issue. Like psychodynamically, that's kind of how I'm oriented as a psychotherapist. And so looking at how this makes sense as we've talked about it right now, but also even just to include like one of the subpopulations of this conversation being adult children of alcoholics.
Yeah.
Like that to me just reveals that though they may not themselves have a substance abuse issue, they have a internal working model of the world that is riddled with the effects of the strategies of substance abuse.
Yeah.
And so their prediction making mechanisms in their mind of how the current situation will unfold, what is a threat in the current situation, all of that has been shaped throughout the lifetime.
Yeah.
One of the cases that's sticking out to me is that every time this person's mother would pick them up from school, she was drunk. And so they would have multiple times a week near death experiences with like drifting over into the other lane, then like reactivity from the mom to like, you know, the children's expression of fear. And then that would overcorrect into like, now we're in the ditch and all kinds of things of never feeling like I was actually okay.
Yeah.
Even though my mom, I knew she was hurting.
Yeah.
But, you know, what was I supposed to do? So to me, when we're understanding like even like the history taking process of this, looking so much way broader than just like, what is your experience with this drug or this whatever?
Yeah. Ryan recently found a book. It's old. I had never heard of it. Adult Grandchildren of Alcoholics. If we're going to talk about looking broad,
That's fascinating.
it is fascinating. If you are raised by an adult child of an alcoholic, the codependence, you know, like strategies that are passed on.
I'm getting uncomfortable over here.
No, I know. It's a thin little book. It's old. It's very dated. It probably needs an update, but he really liked it.
So real.
AGCOA.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
So
that's exactly what I am. I had never heard a label for it.
maybe we should both read that and talk about it.
Yeah. What does it mean to be?
We're going to start a new
Another
reading club for the...
You guys read on your topic.
I need to read that as well.
Do you? Okay.
I just said a whole family.
Yeah. True.
Yeah. I mean, like, I think amongst the three of us, I already know that all of us have at least one side of the family that is DSM diagnosable, multiple members with alcoholism at a minimum.
Oh yeah, I thought you were just going to say just general DSM. Like
applicable
but they are the
riddled
book.
with that too. They are the book. Yeah.
Yeah. When that class came up in graduate school, I was like, I'm good. I know what it looks like.
I got it. Yeah.
Very familiar.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, with Bridger, when you were talking about the family of just like that, it was just normal. It's so fascinating because my system is geared to like spot addiction, or quote unquote, I'm air quoting for those of you that can't see that, problematic substances in everything but alcohol for that same reason.
Yep.
So interesting.
Yes. And
It's
like
just been conditioned out of your awareness. Like,
someone's like over drinking or frequent drinking doesn't feel alarming to my body at all. But other substances that possibly have less problems with them feel alarming because it's foreign. But they're natural.
It's so fascinating. Yeah. See, my family was exactly the opposite. So my oldest uncle became an alcoholic at 15 and died by the time he was 45 from alcohol. And so on that side of the family, there's a lot of like reactivity to alcohol. That I'm giggling because it's funny to me now. The uncle that was very addicted to marijuana, I was like, well, he's fine. He never gets
alcohol.
It's not alcohol.
Yeah.
I mean, he picked weed. That was like the best decision he ever made.
Yeah,
because
weed's never killed anyone.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So this is fine. And so, and so then I have a cousin that started struggling with both. And it was fascinating to listen to the family conversations around like, if he would just stick with the weed.
Fascinating.
Like, so, and that goes back to that cultural piece. It's
Yeah.
like the meaning that gets made of these different things and how influential they are in shaping our own stories and our shame narratives around them. Yeah. So interesting.
And
Well,
in
no
my
wonder we're all
family,
therapists, guys.
the treatment of alcoholism is you just stick to beer. That's how
Oh
you
yeah,
treat
yeah,
it.
yeah. No, that's in my family too. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. If he would have just stuck to beer, yeah. If he could have just laid off the liquor, it would have been fine. It's so real.
Yeah, I mean that really is like when you're in recovery.
Like
I'm
when
laughing,
That's
but
pretty
it's so
tough.
true.
Yeah.
Like that is recovery. Is,
Yeah. Okay, so
I only drink beer now.
yeah, my full honesty is like when you say that, there is a huge part of me that's like, yeah, makes sense. Like totally in agreement with
Yes,
that. Like,
that's why
well,
it's
yeah.
just like, oh,
Oh gosh,
that's not right.
that's not true. Oh, okay.
Okay.
We're gonna have to all have a moment of self-reflection about this.
So
Apparently,
resourcing with this population.
Yeah, who knew that this topic was going to bring so much of our own stuff?
oh, well.
Yeah.
So, how about reprocessing some core trauma, you guys?
Yeah.
I recommend it.
I do. Okay. I'm going to bring us back in. Are we ready?
Yeah.
So, we're all sort of aware now that it's strategy. Strategy for what? But then there's that question of the originating events. And I think what is unique about substance abuse is that it's not always the traumas that we would expect. And because of that entanglement and the what fires together, wires together, and all of that, sometimes the core trauma events that we're looking at with substance abuse actually seem rather positive on the surface. And I think I told this story on a recent episode about my partner's entanglement with the feeling of companionship. Right? That would still be considered a core trauma memory associated with an addiction. And for those of you that haven't heard that one, his struggle with cigarettes has to do with the core memory of being a teenager and feeling this tremendous camaraderie with his best friends. And, you know, there were 4 of them in the neighborhood and they called themselves the hooligans, I think. I think it was the hooligans. It was like some old man yelled it at him and they like adopted it as their moniker because they thought it was cool, right? So that experience on the surface, it's a nice story. It's a pleasant story.
Told with laughter,
Told with
smiles,
huge smiles.
warmth.
But that right there is actually the core trauma of feeling like companionship was dependent upon or entangled with this particular substance and activity. And so when we're moving into looking for those core memories in regards to substance abuse, we kind of have to broaden our understanding and really track the emotional learning more than what we would traditionally call trauma.
With a couple of protocols in the substance abuse world, Detour and Miller's Feeling State. Melissa, what you're talking about is how Miller's Feeling State protocol approaches that of how do we, separate those two. They became associated directly of camaraderie and connection comes with this behavior or this substance.
Yeah. Therefore, without the substance, you can't have the other.
Right. So the unpairing of the two. I do think that still then leaves a nervous system that's thirsty and seeking camaraderie and connection because it's not prevalent and it's not easy to access. And so there's sometimes still looking at even beneath where those two got associated. What was the system already set up? What was it searching for and looking for? And what was it missing and lacking before that? And additional maybe repair and resourcing to do in there. But first kind of disconnecting those two. Deter, on the other hand, looks more at targeting triggers. How do we identify what activates that system into desiring that response pattern of that behavior or that substance? And how do we desensitize that? Is it the urge to use? The scale is the urge
Level
to
of
use.
urge to use, yeah.
And how do we reduce the urge to use when that stimuli is present? So both of those are very, very powerful of addressing. I would perceive them more from a top-down approach, like they are symptom reduction, behavior management approaches, but they're very effective. They both speak to the bottom-up work.
Yes.
Like they both acknowledge the need for the core trauma processing. But it gives you a great protocol and tools with your clients to use to say like, hey, if we need something that's pretty efficient and effective in helping to manage this, we can utilize this kind of foot in the door and then come back in and start in that, again, that spiral approach of balancing the two, do some trauma work, go back and desensitize some triggers, and then go do some more trauma work and just kind of teeter-totter.
Yeah. Another resource, and we've done a episode on this. It's been a long time ago, I think, the two-handed interweave. I learned that in a training by a woman named Jan Schaad, SCHAAD, and her organization is EMDR Practice. You can find her at emdrpractice.com. But she teaches the two-handed interweave as a protocol to use when we're dealing with addictions and compulsive behaviors as a bottom-up approach to a consequence analysis, right? So, the top-down version is like, let me list all the consequences of my bad behavior. But the two-handed interweave lets us actually feel into the perceived benefits versus the perceived consequences of that addiction or behavior. And what I have observed in doing that is that almost invariably it's a surprise what emerges. The feeling behind the why is often not at all what people expected. And it's also a way of inviting the body to really start communicating about what is held there affectively in regards to this pattern, in a really gentle, invitational way. So if you guys don't know how to do the two-handed interweave, we do have a full episode on how to do that. And I think a demonstration, actually.
Yeah.
It's kind of old at this point,
That was
but
a long
still
time
good.
ago.
It was a long time ago. But that's another resource. And Jan Schaad, she does consultation and sometimes does training specifically for EMDR and addictions. And I really recommend her work.
Yeah. When looking at reprocessing the core trauma, a couple of things that I utilize to orient, like, what do we process in now? Like, what is the core trauma? It's not always just those big, huge life moments that we think like, oh, well, it must be that sexual abuse is what's leading to your meth addiction. It has to be that. Like, we want to be looking beyond that and very like intentionally choosing the trauma we're working on. And so looking at, when did this system first learn that it needed strategy? And that takes us back to an episode we recently recorded on, like, that can go all the way back to those first attachment relationships. But when and how did it learn that it needed strategy? When did it learn that specific strategy was going to be super effective?
Yeah. Or that this thing would aid my strategy kind of like network.
Yes.
To really help me in the way that I need it to.
Yeah. And then when are some really specific like experiences or felt experiences or moments in time that further perpetuated that highlighted it more, insulated it more, maybe an attempt to not utilize it that failed, or the utilization of it and it was super successful. Like, we're being mindful of those types of experiences to become material to target and reprocess.
The other area that, especially if somebody has been in long-term addiction, targeting the trauma of living the lifestyle of addiction is also really relevant.
It creates a whole new networks of trauma.
Yeah. I mean, just the amount of dissociation that is required, the amount of, just exposure to risk that that lifestyle often creates, the dangerous situations that people find themselves in. And also the perpetual feeling of being out of control of yourself is actually traumatic to our bodies, to feel like I'm doing these things and I don't want to do them, and yet I keep doing them. All of that produces a lot of alarm in our system. And so processing the trauma of living that way and everything that they experience in the midst of that lifestyle is really relevant as well, and is very helpful, especially kind of towards the end of treatment when they're beginning to imagine life after and like moving forward, and where we would start to incorporate some future templating and things like that. Oftentimes it's right there where that old fear of everything that they have been through starts to emerge, and so it can be really helpful to track some of that as well.
Yeah. Any final thoughts? Or
I think my kind of takeaway from our conversation, but then also just like what I'm just so reminded of as I think about these things in the work that we do. For me, it's understanding how this makes sense, like whatever it is, substances, processes, whatever. Somehow it makes sense. And to me, that is always the breadcrumb trail that I'm keen to find, that I'm really trying hard to help uncover and go together on discovering this path, because it does. And I think that in and of itself is a posture that de-shames or has the potential to de-shame what it is we're really looking for. This is sometimes a very harrowing journey on actually getting to the core of what was going on when this strategy first revealed itself and when it became so just intoxicating.
The process of therapy is an invitation into co-regulation, and substance abuse and addiction is the like rigidity against co-regulation. It's like to
self-regulation. Yes.
I will engage in something or ingest something that will assist me in regulating because I can't trust in the co-regulation experience.
Right. Others are not safe.
Yes. And so I feel like just the awareness of that piece as we're approaching, if we further perpetuate that message that it's not safe to come to me and experience and feel and process all of those because you're met with shame or, this like rigid approach of you need to do this, why didn't you do that? Like a lack of understanding, it's going to actually perpetuate the issue.
Yeah. This reminds me of a episode we did on the evidence-based therapist, the article Bound to Feel Bad About Oneself, where it's not that I think you'll think I'm bad. It's that I know that I'm bad. And so I don't want to infect you with my badness. Yes. And so I will self-regulate over here. That just came to mind when you were talking about self-regulation.
So I think that we can, as the therapist, could perpetuate it accidentally, that need to like go over and like regulate yourself. Like,
that's right.
But also knowing that our invitation into co-regulation may be very terrifying, will be very terrifying.
It is.
And so just like really easing into that and speaking about it explicitly and recognizing that journey together is one that could be like very activating for them, but also could be the medicine that's needed.
Yeah. And there's a huge conversation to be had that we don't have time for right now around fears and stories around codependency in connection with people that are struggling with addiction. And I hear therapists resist real relationship and resist attachment under the label of not enabling and not falling into codependency. And so it feels important to just clarify codependency is the use of the other person, not relationship with the other person. So as a therapist, well, and for all of us that are humans and have humans in our lives that struggle with addiction, because clearly that's relevant for all of us, feeling into your own self, if you are showing up as an authentic human being or as authentic as you feel safe to with that person, that's not you being codependent. That's you offering the medicine that they actually need, which is a human relationship that has the capacity for co-regulation. Codependency is using them like a drug to get your needs met. And you can feel the difference if there's self-honesty. And if we're struggling with that, we can be in reflection with somebody else to help us navigate that. But I just, I think it's important that we're mindful of there's some story around enabling addicts that I think is very shaming and problematic.
That would be a great future episode.
Yeah, a whole separate thing that we should talk about at some point.
So in closing, I do have one final question, Bridger. Do you make your bed?
Do you make your bed?
You do.
Yeah.
I knew it. As quiet as he was, I knew it.
Well, here's the reality. I was aware of Bridger's bed making habits, but I'm not. I think when
I'll
you
get you
have
back on another episode.
Hey, you already got me with the creamer.
Oh,
okay?
you just wait.
That's
I'll
true.
show you.
That's fair. So here's my self disclosure around bed making. In the morning, I feel pretty good if the sheet managed to stay on my bed the whole night because
wow.
I sleep with 3 dogs and a child and a partner and about 19 pillows in the bed. So it's a disaster. And I'm pretty sure my cleaner has lots of questions over the state of my bed on a regular
happens in here?
Exactly. Like often I find shoes in there, but it's just like you have a toddler and
Yeah.
dogs, and that's my life. But yeah, I don't make my bed.
Yeah.
Not that anyone is surprised about that.
It is always a process that begins in my body without my awareness. And that is something that for me, like I often like, this sounds weird, but like resist out of like love for my partner, honestly. Cause
Like you make the bed less now that you have a partner. Yes.
yep.
Uh-huh.
Yes. Yeah. And there's a whole story that we can get into. But for me, yes, if it were up to me all the time, I would totally. And I take
just
deep
checking.
enjoyment in it. Why are you just, what was that question?
Just checking.
Jamie, let's cut this out. This is this part.
Yeah. We don't need this bit. Someday we'll do a whole episode on human strategy in regards to how you navigate partnering in a bed with another human or really any other
there's
mammal.
so much
I thought you were
there.
going to say the strategies of a therapist. And I was like, why don't you not worry about it?
Oh, well, that too. Jeez, it wasn't going
Yeah.
to call us out that badly. Yeah.
I'm up for it.
Oh, or is that a strategy, Jen? You're just super open to like critiques and
I'll go
openness.
there.
And I'm not afraid of anything.
Danger.
All
All
right,
right,
let's
we
wrap
better
this up.
end
Yeah,
this
let's,
Yeah.
that's a wrap.
All right, guys.
Thank you so much for listening.
Yes, we'll be covering more special protocols and special populations in the episodes to come.
Bye-bye.
Bye.